The Supreme Court has now accepted Donald Trump's petition to challenge the Colorado ballot removal case in their courtroom to settle this once and for all for the entire nation. But something that is happening is the Supreme Court is under attack. In particular, Clarence Thomas, House Democrats, say he's got to go. Now that we've got 9 judges who are going to be weighing this case, be very useful for the left if they could take out somebody who's on the right. Make this a 4-4 decision. Maybe they'll get Squishy John Roberts to join over here, and we can just flop a position where it's a split on the court. So the 3 lefties plus Roberts. And then we have the rest of the judges on the conservative right, all kind of hanging out. It's going to be a curious little battle, but people like Dan Goldman, AOC, Guam's going to capsize guy, all are saying that Thomas must recuse himself. And so let's see who wrote this filing here. You can see January 4th from Congress of the United States. They write this over to the honorable, very honorable Clarence Thomas. Normally I scoff at that phrase when we're talking about Congress, but not with Clarence. He's the man. They say here, Clarence, now that you're going to be considering this Trump case, we don't think you should be on the court. Please recuse yourself from us. They say, Dear Justice Thomas, on December 15th, and let's find out who wrote this, by the way. Who are the people who signed off on this? Okay, Madeline Dean, Glenn Ivey, Gerald Connolly, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. We've got Melanie Stansbury, Jasmine Crockett, you know her, and of course, Dan Goldman, loser. So all these people sign off on this thing, and guess who is the original author of this? Henry Hank Johnson Jr. And I know that you probably don't know everybody on this list, but you certainly know Hank Johnson because he's the Guam Capsize guy. And he is the person who is signing off on this top line. Now, just before we get into the filing, you can see we've got 3 pages of goodness to get to. Who is Hank Johnson, you might be wondering, for those of you who do not remember this clip? Well, Hank Johnson is Mr. Capsize Man. And about 13 years ago, Hank Johnson was still in Congress, and Anderson Cooper had an interesting comment about something that happened with our friend Hank. Here's what we have.
Things happened in Planet Washington. I actually thought this was kind of an April Fool's joke when I saw it today, but it's not. It took place last week in a House Armed Services Committee hearing discussing a military buildup on the island of Guam.
13 years ago.
Here's Georgia Congressman Hank Johnson. Listen.
This is an island that at its widest level is, 12 miles from shore to shore, and at its smallest level or smallest location, it's 7 miles between one shore and the other. Is that correct?
I don't have the exact dimensions, but to your point, sir, I think Guam is a small island.
So it's like 12 here,
and about 24
7
miles, if I recall,
12,
long.
7.
24 miles long, about 7 miles wide at the
7 here,
least widest
12 here,
place on the island, and about 12 miles on the widest part of the island.
Anderson's working hard over there.
And I don't know how many square miles that is. Do you happen to know?
I don't have that figure
like
with me,
12.
sir. I can certainly supply it to you if you'd like.
My fear is that the whole island will become so overly populated that it will tip over and capsize.
We don't anticipate that.
I got to say, I'm impressed with the Admiral Robert Willard, who's head of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, for not laughing, frankly. Later, when he was asked for a clarification, a spokesman for the Congressman Johnson said he meant that adding about 8,000 Marines and their families to the population of Guam could be a tipping point to the island's infrastructure and ecosystem, that he was, quote, obviously joking. You can decide for yourself.
Obviously joking. Obviously. You know, not a capsize. It's just a tipping point. Oh, Hank. He wasn't joking, not even a little bit, okay? He thought the whole dang island was going to flip over. Okay, so he's been in Congress. That was 13 years ago. He's still around. I don't know if he knows more about islands or anything, but he's the author of this letter. All right, so he says, all right, dear Justice Thomas, on December 15th, we wrote imploring you that you recuse yourself from any participation in the case of Donald Trump. Why? Given your wife's intimate involvement in Trump's alleged efforts to overturn the election and to obstruct its certification. And this week, Judge, we're compelled to write to you again. And this time, we must urge you again to recuse yourself from the case of Anderson versus Griswold, because your impartiality is reasonably questioned by substantial numbers of fair-minded members of the public who believe that your wife, Virginia, aka Ginny, and her substantial involvement in the events leading up to J6 and the financial incentive it presents to your household if Trump is reelected are disqualifying. Now, as we noted in our last letter, the Supreme Court has announced a formal code of conduct, and you said that a justice should disqualify himself when their impartiality might reasonably be questioned. Now, the code details where you should boot yourself, and he cites the code. So what's interesting about this is, remember, the left, they were essentially beating up Judge Thomas for saying that his wife was hanging out with cool people who were absolutely right about the election, which makes him more qualified, not less. Anyways, point is, they said, you guys need a standard of ethics. And so the Supreme Court said, okay, leave us alone. Here's our ethics. And then they said, aha, thank you for those. Now you're violating your own ethics, which is why you don't play with these people. When summoned to testify before the House J6 committee, your wife told the committee that she did go to the Stop the Steal rally. Shout out to Mrs. Ginny Thomas, where Trump ginned up. Oh, that's interesting. I wonder if they're using that intentionally. Where Trump ginned up the attendees, right? So it's Ginny was there being ginned up, probably intentional. The attendees into a mob, which he then dispatched into the Capitol to, quote, fight like hell. Where he also said, is there peacefully and patriotically in here? Nope, not in there. The January 6th rally then morphed into an attack after they denied the National Guard and after the House Sergeant at Arms ignored Capitol Hill Chief of Police Stephen Sund's phone call for many hours. Then Colorado court found him to have caused an insurrection, and that disqualifies Trump. Now, not only did your wife attend the J6 rally, but she was instrumental in planning it and bringing the insurrectionists to the Capitol. Your wife was one of 9 board members for a conservative political group called Stop the Steal, a movement which culminated in the January 6th attack. Is that right? They're responsible for it, then why are they prosecuting Trump? It's unthinkable that you could be impartial, Judge Thomas, when deciding an event that your wife personally organized qualifies as an insurrection. And further, your wife of 36 years, Miss Thomas, it's Miss Thomas now, it's not Ginny. Ginny, okay, well, they went back to Miss Thomas. She has shown a fervent bias in favor of Mr. Trump. She's awesome, totally. And it's hard to believe that her bias has no impact on you, which is why reasonable people of relevant facts say that you cannot fairly discharge your duties. Miss Thomas urged Trump's chief of staff to pursue unrelenting efforts to, he says, overturn the election. I'd say enforce it, ending only days after the attack on the Capitol. She also signed a letter urging Kevin McCarthy, who's useless. And, speaking of Kevin, is he behind this exit of these Republicans? Apparently, more and more Republicans are resigning. He started it. And my question, of course, is he encouraging it so that the Republicans lose the House because he's so stinking spiteful? Representatives Al Kinzinger and Liz Cheney, they said she wanted them to remove them. Now, she was a witness for Congress at the January 6th committee due to her intimate involvement, and they say that committee's report is integral. So in other words, she testified in the January 6th committee, and the January 6th committee was incorporated by Colorado, even though it's hearsay and it's multiple layers removed. They included it. They say, oh, because she testified there. And by the way, they interviewed basically everybody. They say, now that case is before you, and so she's got to go. In her testimony to the committee, she said she still believes the 2020 election has been stolen. Shout out to her, man. Solid. There is no evidence that her views have softened. Good. Should have hardened, actually. And it is unreasonable to conclude that your wife's fervent views do not bleed over to your opinions, and they affect your ability to be impartial. And finally, it's foreseeable that your wife's earning capacity will also be positively impacted by this. From the little that is public about her for-profit firm called Liberty Consulting, it is clearly aligned with Trump's interests. Well, she's a conservative. Liberty Consulting's few known clients include Fed Up PAC, Center for Security Policy, and the value of her consulting firm skyrocketed from up to $15,000 to up to $100,000 during his presidency, and then fell again after he lost the White House, is what they say. Now, that is a reference to a CNBC article. They say Ms. Thomas and her professional and financial interests are so aligned with Trump that if he gets reelected, she's going to make more money. Now, your wife's income benefits your household, and therefore your family and you personally, Clarence, you have a financial stake in this outcome, which disqualifies you from any involvement in it. Fewer than half of all Americans trust SCOTUS. That number is going to fall even lower if you rule in this case, they say. A judge should not sit in judgment of his own wife's behavior, nor in judgment of their fortunes. And yet that's exactly what's happening here. And so to protect this court, you must recuse yourself. Signed by Hank Johnson, Mr. Capsize, Guam. So you can see what's happening here, right? It's a full-on attack. I do not think that Judge Thomas should or will recuse himself. Obviously, I think that this is something that is being used as a political attack against him, obviously. And it's signed by Hank Johnson. Now, obviously, this is a very racist letter, by the way, because this is just clearly racist. Now, I think they're trying to mitigate the racism of the language by having Hank Johnson be the primary signature of this, like, for example, they didn't have Dan Goldman sign that, that's interesting. Probably to rebut some of that racist stuff. But anyways, still very racist. I mean, how dare they say something like this against Clarence Thomas? It is reprehensible. He is an honorable man, and we're looking forward to the court not recusing him off of the case. But here's Dan Goldman and other lefties. They're reacting to this. This is part of the long plan to try to marginalize the Supreme Court, to try to keep Trump off the ballot. If they can start to whittle away at their power, maybe they'll get their way.
Signed that letter along with Congressman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Hank Johnson, I think the principal author of it, and a few other members of the House. It seems very clear, as strong a case of recusal as one could imagine.
Well, it is a strong case. It's even
You mean like Judge Chutkan's recusal?
stronger because Clarence Thomas has already recused himself from a January 6th case. You'll remember there was an uproar when it came out about his wife's role in the January 6th case, and the fact that he had not recused himself from an earlier Supreme Court case related to turning over text messages from Mark Meadows, I believe, to the January 6th committee. After that uproar, after it was revealed the extent of which his wife was involved, he then did recuse himself in a case that went up to the court about John Eastman's communications related to January 6th. So it's not only that this is an open and shut case of an appearance of a conflict of interest, if not an actual conflict of interest, but it is precedent that he has set himself. And so if he now does not recuse from this case,
see what happens?
He will clearly be picking and choosing which cases related to January 6th he wants to rule on and which he doesn't think are sufficiently important for him to insist on ruling upon. And it just underscores how important it is for the Supreme Court, and if the Supreme Court does not do it, for Congress itself to implement new ethics rules on the Supreme Court so that it is not just up to Clarence Thomas to make this decision himself.
Okay, so they're going to attack the court, attack the court, attack the court. Every time you give these people an inch, they take a mile, which is why you can't give them anything. So Judge Thomas recused himself on a prior case, and now they say he's got to recuse himself on all the cases. And that was the John Eastman case. Now it's the Trump case. Now it's on a national issue, a national election. They're trying to marginalize the court so that they can win, because they are cheaters and bullies. That's the only way they can win. They cannot win when they battle ideas, which is why they censor everybody and try to silence you from participating even in the election. So House Dems attack Clarence Thomas. We're going to be here defending him and defending this process because they're trying to steal an election right in front of our eyes. We're not going to let that happen. So thank you for subscribing, my friends. Thanks for sharing this show with a friend or family member, inviting them to come and join us. And don't forget to check out robertgovea.com. We've got a daily newsletter there. We have a lot of good stuff happening along with our shop there. So check that out as well. Great way to support our work. Thanks for being here, my friends. We'll see you on the next one.